Hey friends, welcome to another video of training. Today we'll be discussing the refrigeration cycle. Maybe you're going to a trade school and you're learning about it right now. Maybe you've been out in the field for some time, or maybe you're thinking about getting into the HVAC trade. But the refrigeration cycle is so important to understand. At first, it might seem complex, but once you understand the basic functions, you understand the certain components that are in the refrigeration cycle, you'll have a better grasp as how it works. Now, before we even jump into the refrigeration cycle, we're gonna go over with what happens with water. And hopefully, once you understand this, it'll help you understand how the refrigeration cycle really works. Let's briefly talk about water. We know that water freezes at 32 degrees. And so we have a block of ice, and if we continue removing heat, it's going to get colder, 31, 30 degrees. But something interesting happens to water, as we mentioned, at 32 degrees. It freezes. So let's say we have a block of ice, right? And we have heat here. And this heat can be your hand, it can be flame, anything that's going to add heat. Let's say you have a block of ice of 31. We're adding heat. So at 31, because we're adding heat, it's going to go to 32. At 32 degrees, that ice starts to melt. As we continue to add heat, you have less ice, less solid, and more water, more liquid. You're continuing to add heat, and what happens? Well, you have less ice, more liquid. You have a lot less ice, more liquid, and then you have maybe just a grain of ice and then more liquid, and then boom, completely liquid. Why is this important though? Well, because of this. So at 31 degrees, right, we add heat. Once it hits 32, as long as it has ice, even though, as you can see, this one has more ice than this little piece of ice right there, my temperature remains the same. As long as there's a mix of ice and water, the temperature remains the same. And I kind of drew a graph here so you can understand. But here with water, let's say we have a block of ice. It can get colder than 32 degrees. It could be 31, 30, 29. Once it hits 32 degrees, though, there is a change of state, but no change in temperature. I want to repeat it. When you have a mix of ice and water, as long as you have, even though it's a little bit of ice, as long as you have a mix, the temperature remains the same. And that's what we call latent heat. Latent heat is your hidden heat, your saturated mix of vapor and liquid, which we'll talk about in the refrigeration cycle, but it is a change in state, but no change in temperature. Now, sensible heat, so let's say the ice turns to complete water, 100% water. Now, I'm no longer changing state, but now I can change the temperature. So as I add heat to this water, right, now it's going to be 33 degrees. I add heat, 34, 35. I'm adding heat. That's your sensible heat. When you look at this graph here, because we're away from that change of state, and we can put this here latent heat. Once it's 100% liquid, right, now we can go up in temperature, and that's sensible heat. And the same applies over here. If I have a block of ice and I continue to remove heat, then it can drop in temperature because it's ice. It's complete ice. We're removing heat, 30, 30, 29, 28, 27. This is sensible heat right here. So you see the correlation here? Sensible heat, because it's just ice. It hasn't changed state. But right here I have ice and liquid. It's a mix. That's my latent heat. Change of state, because it's changing state. We're adding heat, but no change in temperature. Once it's 100% water, and I continue to add heat, then it can go up in temperature, 32, 33 degrees, 180 degrees. And something else interesting happens once you hit 212 degrees. Water begins to turn to vapor, steam, however you like to refer to it. Vapor, steam. At 212, we have to add a lot of heat to that water for it to change completely to steam. But while it changes in that state, temperature does not change. You're changing state. Once again, this is latent heat. Guess what? Once that last molecule of liquid water turns to steam, it's 100% steam. Then I can continue increasing the temperature to 213, 214. So sensible heat, change in temperature, no change in state. You see the difference? Latent heat is changing the state, but no change in temperature. Sensible heat is change in temperature, but no change of state. So that's going to be very important to understand as we go into the refrigeration cycle. But just understanding this, that as long as you have a mix, the temperature stays the same. So have in mind these two terms here, latent heat, saturated. These are just synonyms. It's just another word for latent heat. And then sensible heat. That's going to be so important as we go into the refrigeration cycle. And hopefully, if you understand this now, at this point now, we can now move on to the refrigeration cycle. You'll see that it's pretty fun to go over, talk about it, because at the end of the day, once you get it, no one can take that away from you. So let's go to the refrigeration cycle now. Do you remember latent and sensible heat? Well, that's going to be very important as that pertains to the refrigeration cycle, which we'll go over right now. But let's just start off by talking about the four main components. We got the compressor, we have the condenser here, we have the metering device, and then we have our evaporator right here. Okay, so our four main components. Every refrigeration system that you work on, whether it's comfort cooling, industrial, refrigeration, refrigerators, they all have this concept here, these four main components: compressor, condenser fan, condenser, metering device, and evaporator. Okay, so far so good. Good. Let's continue. Okay. So at the end of the day, if you're talking about comfort cooling, right? If you're doing residential, like commercial, even commercial, um, Mrs. Applebottom only cares about that air coming out cold. Let's agree. She only cares about that supply vent. She wants cold air coming out. That's all she cares about. She's not gonna ask you about the refrigeration cycle. I mean, it could happen, but she just cares about that coming out cold. So we're gonna go ahead and split this in two. So this is inside, right? Inside of the house, and this is outside. So we just said that Mrs. Applebottom just cares about that supply vent coming out cold. She wants the house to be not too cold because she's gonna have to put a blanket on, but cold enough where it's fresh because it's hot outside. So how do we get this part, because it's inside of the house, the evaporator, to be cold? Well, this is just one of four main components, and every single component needs to work for this to work. Now, there is a pressure temperature relationship. Now, this is pretty cool. We're dealing with refrigerant, and refrigerant in any case here can be 100% liquid, 100% vapor, or a mix of vapor and liquid. And we already have engineers and smart people that have been able to deal with refrigerant and manipulate the refrigerant molecules in such a way that we can actually use refrigerant now to cool a house down. So we don't have to worry about too much about it when it comes to that, but we do have to worry about temperature because it's all about heat transfer. So let's start off with the compressor. The compressor is a vapor pump. It is the heart of the compressor. It's the heart of the system, of the refrigeration cycle, but it's a vapor pump. It can only take vapor in, vapor out. That's all we're doing here. There's going to be a couple more details we'll be describing here in a bit, but there's something called the gas loss, and if you were to ask me, I won't be able to recite that out of memory. But there's just one that's very important. It's called the Gay-Lussac's law. It basically just says, and think about the refrigeration cycle, right? Let's say this has 10 pounds of refrigerant, right? 10 pounds. As long as we don't add more refrigerant, we're not changing the volume, right? So if we want to change the volume, if we want to add more refrigerant, we're going to change how much refrigerant that system has. But 10 pounds, that's not changing. This is the key right here. If we increase pressure, and for pressure, I'll put PSI, we increase temperature. There's a relationship with that. Same thing. If we increase temperature, we increase pressure. So that's important to understand, and you'll know right now. This line here is called the suction line. So the refrigerant, the vapor molecules are traveling that way. So the suction line is pretty big, right? It can be 3/4 or 7/8. This line here is the discharge line. This line is a lot smaller. And guess what happens to those vapor molecules? Once we compress those molecules into a very, very tight space, like this, it's very tight. You go from like this to like maybe half the size. The vapor molecules are like bumping into each other and it's just very uncomfortable for them. Well, we are increasing the pressure. So this right here, what we're doing here, the compressor, what it's doing, it is a pressure increaser. That's what it's doing. It's increasing the pressure from here to here. So because we just said, if we increase pressure, we increase temperature. Right here, we have about, and this just rule of thumb, it can change, about 165 degrees. 165 degrees. Now, that is the actual surface. So that line is the hottest line in the refrigeration cycle. You touch that line, it will burn you. Now, of course, we're just talking about a system that has no issues. It's operating correctly. 165 degrees, more or less. It can be more, it can be less, but around there. Now, have in mind the 165 degrees, that refers to the surface, right? Just the surface. The pressure inside the system on this side, which is outside, inside, it's about 340 psi. It's just an example, right? Rule of thumb, but it typically will be around that 340 psi. Now, if you're able to find out the pressure, and I'm sure you've dealt with the pressure temperature chart, we're dealing with 410A. 410A refrigerant at 340 psig or pressure, it is 105 degrees. 105 degrees. Now, remember sensible and latent heat. This is important here. So the discharge line, and remember suction is sucking in, discharge coming out, right? So 165 degrees hot to touch because let's say outside, right? Let's just say outside outside the house, let's say it's just maybe between 90 and 95 degrees. This is outside air temperature. Just to kind of give you an idea. So it's warm outside because this 165 degrees is hotter than the outside air temperature, right? Because hot goes to less hot. I mean, to keep it simple, hot goes to cold. But this 165 degrees will naturally go to the outside air temperature because that is hotter than the outside air temperature. It just goes to it, right? Because hot goes to cold. So right here, right away, on this part, I lose 50 degrees. right? I lose 50 degrees. And guess what that's called? That's called sensible heat, because we're not changing state, right? We're just changing temperature. We lost 50 degrees. So right here, this part, and we could do, let's see, we'll do this. That's sensible right here. This part is sensible. But guess what happens? Once I get the first molecule right here of liquid, now I have liquid and vapor. What did we say about latent heat when we talked about that block of ice melting into water? And as long as you had a mix, the temperature stayed the same. So guess what? This 105 degrees, which we got because of our pressure, right? We had to convert it 340 for 410A is 105 degrees. As long as I have liquid and vapor mix, it remains the same temperature. And so then we got 105 degrees here, 105 degrees here, 105 degrees here, 105 degrees right there. But the reason why we're dropping and we're changing state is because we're rejecting heat. We have something called the condenser fan. So this condenser fan is pulling air from the sides and then rejecting heat. So we are rejecting heat. And because we're rejecting heat, not only did we lose sensible heat, now we're on the latent heat removal. So even though you can't see it, right? If you were to take a infrared like temperature gun, you'll see that this here stays the same. But just because it stays the same, many people think, well, I'm not removing any heat. We are removing heat. Look at it here. We're getting more liquid and less vapor. So this part here is called my latent heat. Change of state, no change in temperature, because we are rejecting heat. We're using a condenser fan to bring in this 95 degree to go over this condenser coil, and this is hotter than the outside air temperature. So we're removing heat. So another synonym or another word for condenser would be heat rejector. So discharge line, sensible, ouch, it hurts, but guess what? Because it's too hot, boom, I lose 50 degrees, goes to the ambient air, and then it gets to the point where I develop my first molecule of liquid. It's saturated, it is latent. I have a mix of vapor and liquid. Temperature stays the same, latent heat. Once that last molecule of vapor is gone, and it's 100% liquid, guess what this is called here? If you said sensible heat, you got it right. So this here is sensible heat removal. So then I have 105, 104 because I'm still rejecting heat, right? Still rejecting heat, 103. And let's say at the end we get to 95 degrees. 95. So I got 95 degrees, and then I hit the metering device. Metering device. I'm sure you've learned that we have a couple of different metering devices. We have pistons, capillary tubes, TXVs. We have something also called the electronic expansion valves that mini splits have, but it's just a piece of hull. And what the metering device does, it drops the pressure. It's a pressure dropper. So pressure increaser, pressure dropper. Okay, so put pressure dropper. It kind of makes sense, right? When you have it's like a water, you have a water hose, and you have a certain amount of water coming out. You put your thumb, and then you have a little bit of water just coming out, like from one corner. That's all we're doing right here. But remember, this is very important. Gay-Lussac's law, right? If we increase pressure, we increase temperature. If we increase temperature, we increase pressure. But guess what happens here? If we decrease, and I put it right here, if we decrease, it also applies for the decrease part, decrease pressure, we also decrease, you got it right, temperature. Because here I'm decreasing pressure because we're forcing this pressure, and have in mind it has to be 100% liquid. If it's vapor, you can't meter it. It has to be 100% liquid. We got this high pressure lower temperature liquid, right? It's still high, but you got this liquid coming through and it's forced to go through a little hole, dropping in pressure. And when we drop in pressure, we drop in temperature. So now my pressure on this side and on the evaporator side, I have 118 psi. So for 410A on a pressure temperature chart, that equates to 40 degrees. So here you have 40 degrees now. You're like, great. Now that evaporator coil is cold, Mrs. Applebottom's gonna be happy, right? Because we were able to drop the pressure. But you see, you need that metering device. Without that, nothing will work. Without the compressor, it won't work because you need to increase the pressure. Without the condenser fan being able to reject heat, the condenser coil, it just won't work. Every part is very important. Okay, so we got 40 degrees here. So you got about, let's just do 80% liquid, 20% vapor. But this is lower temp though, right? Lower temp. It's not the same as over here. This is higher temp liquid and vapor. This is lower temp liquid and vapor. Now, remember what we, and I might have actually not have said this, but as long as it is saturated, meaning that it is a mix of vapor and liquid, it doesn't matter what refrigerant you're dealing with. As long as it's saturated and you know that there is a mix of vapor and liquid, which you will find latent heat or saturated in your condenser and your evaporator, you can know the temperature. But it needs to be saturated. It needs to be a mix. So after the metering device, it's 80-20. It's saturated. This part here is latent, saturated. So let's say I connect my gauges. My gauges give me 118. Hey, I know the temperature is 40 degrees because it's saturated. So yes, we lose about 20% goes to vapor, but liquid is what we want. This is a good ratio. We want liquid. This is what does the cooling, which you'll see right now. So you got this 80% liquid, 20% vapor. Now, remember what we said. That compressor is a vapor pump. So how do we do it so that this 80% liquid doesn't end up in the compressor? How do we do that? Because it's a vapor pump. We only want vapor molecules going in that compressor. Well, we got the indoor motor. So the indoor motor, whether you're working with a permanent split capacitor motor or a electrocommutative motor, an ECM motor, constant torque or variable speed, you're bringing in air from the return, and you know where the return is at. You go to the hallway, you have a thermostat, you look up, you have a big return grill with the filter, and that's if it's in the hallway. It can be up by the unit, but that's the return. Heat rises, it's picking up all the air, right? It's picking up all the air from the house. So you have this return air. Let's say it's 80 degrees, 80-degree return air, okay? Okay. Now, remember what we said. We need to get rid of that liquid. We cannot have that compressor taking any liquid molecules. How am I going to be able to boil off that liquid? Because if you think about it, what's higher, liquid or vapor? Well, vapor is, right. Vapor's a little bit more warmer as a result of liquid like boiling off. So how do we go from a mix of liquid and vapor, which you have more liquid, right here, to complete vapor? Well, we need to add heat. If we add heat to the 80% liquid, 20% vapor, we're going to boil off that liquid because that liquid is going to turn to vapor until it's 100% vapor. Where do we get that heat? Oh, this is where Mrs. Applebottom would be happy to hear, but return air is 80 degrees. You got this warm return air going through this cold coil. That return air is boiling off the liquid. So that's why it makes sense to run the air conditioner system on a hot or warm day, especially if it's inside the house, it's warm. Running an air conditioning system on a very cold day doesn't make sense because you need some heat to boil off all the liquid molecules. So as you have this return air going through this coil, look at this. you have less liquid as you go through the coil and you're having more vapor molecules. That is why the liquid is what does the cooling. It's important we have a good portion of liquid here. So return air going through it, boiling off, getting rid of all that liquid. You're having more vapor molecules, but guess what? You're like, no, I don't want the liquid molecules to be gone. No, that's good. We want the compressor's a vapor pump, but we're also doing cooling. If we got 80 degrees coming in, boom, we got 60 degrees coming out. Yes, now we are cooling. But we're cooling just because we have a good amount of liquid. It's 40 degrees. And we're boiling off all the liquid until it's 100% vapor. So as long as it's saturated, which we already talked about, 40 degrees, 40 degrees, 40 degrees, last molecule of liquid, 40 degrees. This part here is called latent heat, which we've talked about. Latent heat is saturated. And then this part here, where you have 100% vapor, it is sensible. It is gaining sensible. And this is where superheat comes into effect. Superheat and subcool. But just going back to this right here, right? 100% vapor. When it's 100% vapor, it's already changed states. We're still adding heat, right? We're still adding heat. So because we're adding heat and we already changed states, 41 degrees, 42, unless we get to 52 degrees. 52. But are you starting to understand why heat transfer is so important? Evaporator, it's cold. We need warm air so it can do the heat transfer. Boil off the liquid and also turn that 80 degree to 60 degree air so we can do cooling. On the condenser side, it's really hot. The condensing temperature is hotter than the outdoor air temperature. We need heat transfer. And because the outdoor air temperature is cooler, the condensing temperature gives its heat to the outside air temperature, removing sensible heat, latent heat, and still having that subcooled liquid. Now, the reason why the discharge line is hot to the touch, because three things primarily. Pressure increaser, right? We talked about Gay-Lussac's law. Vapor molecules into the discharge line. They're all like fighting. Pressure increases. Hence, we increase temperature. We also have that superheated vapor. Remember right here, last molecule of liquid was gone. We gained, what is it? Superheated vapor. We gained 12 degrees of superheat. And we're not going to go too much into superheat, but it is important, right? But superheat is heat added to vapor after it's 100% vapor. So that 12 degrees takes into account is part of that number. So we have pressure increaser, the superheat or superheated vapor. Superheat, if I can spell. Superheated vapor. And we're also cooling the windings of the compressor, right? So that actually makes sense. People think, well, my system is low on refrigerant, so my compressor is not pumping a lot. It shouldn't overheat. What overheats, and although it's true, compressor with low refrigerant its amp draw is gonna be lower, but what cools the windings is that superheated vapor. So if it's hot to the touch, a lot of the times it's low on refrigerant. But that is why the discharge line is so hot. It increases the pressure, superheated vapor, the 12 degrees, and we're cooling the windings. So just to kind of recap, right? It's all about heat transfer. Sensible heat, latent heat is always occurring in the refrigeration cycle. You see, right away, I lose sensible heat, 50 degrees. Bye. Because that's so hot and my ambient air is so cooler, boom, 50 degrees just goes away. I hit my point where I develop my first molecule of liquid, right? So we talked about the pressure. We connect our hose, 340 psig. That's 105 degrees. We're removing heat, condenser fan spinning, latent, right? Changes, it stays the same temperature. And so once the the last molecule of liquid vapor is gone, we then have 100% liquid. And that is when we can actually start to remove sensible heat. And so we want a good measure of subcooled liquid here, right? We want liquid because that tells us, hey, you got 10 degrees of subcool, because that tells me if you have 10 degrees of subcool, not only did you change state, but you turned to a liquid and you still dropped 10 degrees. So then we can now meter that, because we can meter or drop in pressure if it's vapor. Boom, saturated. If you know saturated, you know your temperature. We connect our hose to the low side of the system. And so we got saturated, 40, 40, 40, 40, 40, 40, 40, boom, into that one last molecule of vapor of liquid is gone. And we're boiling off that liquid because the return has heat going through that cold coil, coming out cold. And now we get our superheated vapor. So you see why it's so important to have heat transfer. At the end of the day, with air conditioning, we're using the refrigeration cycle to transfer heat. My mom always thought, she thought that, especially with the window AC unit that she has, that it would just suck the air from the house and just throw it out. And even when I explain it to her, she just cares about the air coming out cold. And that's our jobs, right? It's not the customer's job to understand this. They just wanna. That's what we're there to provide the service. They want to feel that cold, fresh air coming out, and it's our job to understand the refrigeration cycle and to see how each component, compressor, condenser fan, condenser rather, the metering device, the evaporator, how they're all important. And yes, you need heat transfer. Condenser fan needs to be working. The blower motor needs to be working. Cleaning the filters. Supply vents must be open. Making sure the coil and the condenser is not dirty. Everything is so important. And that is why air conditioning is just such a cool trade, because you never stop learning. I'm always learning something new every day. But I really hope that today's video was able to give you a basic understanding of how the refrigeration cycle works. You can take this knowledge here, apply it to commercial, industrial, it all works the same. Friends, I hope this video helped you out today, and I will catch you guys on the next one.